Perfect. Hello, everyone. If you haven't seen my face yet, my name is Emily Nicholson. I'm one of the program coordinators for the Dye for Ag program and the Dye for Ag Challenge, which I am so excited about. In the virtual room today, we also have Dr. Kristen Moore, and I'll let her introduce herself, and then she will pass it off to our content expert today, who's going to talk about photography.
Kristen Moore. I am also the counterpart to the Dye for Ag team, but I also work for 4-H, just like Ellie. So I'll lead into Ellie introducing herself.
And I'm Ellie Courthouse. I work with Benton County 4-H, and I've also been a 4-H judge for photography for several years, and have a small photography business outside of the normal work. All right. So jumping right into this, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but we're just going to go over some basics of photography. Now, there's some goals that I'm hoping that we meet today, and that includes kind of figuring out what a high quality photo looks like, learning the difference between some of the different types of cameras out there, and then just talking about some basic photography principles. Now, in general, what we're looking for with a photo is, one, that it tells a story. We want that audience to be engaged and curious about what's going on. We want a strong focal point, whether that's a human or a non-living subject or animal, anything like that. If it is a human, we do want to see the face. And then, of course, we do want to make sure that those technical aspects are correct. So we'll get into a little bit of those settings, such as exposure and white balance, in just a bit. Now, for types of cameras, this first one is what most everyone has in their pocket. And if you want to click really quick on that. So we have, and then one more click. There we go. Okay. So the first one is cell phone. So what most everyone has in your pocket already. And so with the cell phones, they are readily available, which is awesome. There are a lot of advancements that have gone into cell phone technology. However, there are some drawbacks to using cell phones as your primary photography tool. They generally don't have the capability to blow up the image into a larger picture. They can have some issues with pixelation once you start blowing them up too large. And then they also don't have as much wiggle room for manual settings, which we'll get into those in just a little bit. And our next one is the point and shoot camera. Now, this is just, it's one that doesn't have a detachable lens, but it is purely a camera, doesn't have any other functions. It could have the video, but with the point and shoot, it's pretty similar to the cell phone and its capabilities. It might have some specific settings for, let's say, an action mode or a portrait mode, something along those lines, but it doesn't necessarily have as much room for manual settings as our next two. All right. And then next, we have the DSLR. Now that means it stands for digital single lens reflex. Now, with that, the DSLR camera has a detachable lens. So that means the lens can be taken off. You can switch it out for a different one. And this is where you're getting into more of a photography hobbyist or into professional level of photography. With the DSLRs, they have a sensor and a mirror in the camera that bounces light to that sensor. So with these cameras, there's a lot of room for really making the photo your own, really getting the shot that you're wanting with those manual settings. And they do have automatic settings as well if you're still trying to figure out just basic composition. Now, our last one is the mirrorless camera. Now that's kind of the newest up and coming technology, where it's very similar to a DSLR. Folks use them interchangeably, but rather than having the mirror that reflects light to the sensor, it's purely digital. So it's a digital sensor that picks up everything. So it's a little bit lighter. They generally are more expensive though, so because they are the newest technology, but they're pretty comparable to the DSLR in a lot of ways. But let's talk about some photography principles. Our first one, click there. We're going to talk about some manual settings. Now we've got 5 listed there. There are a lot more than that, but these are kind of the 5 that I would say are kind of the main focus. Now we're actually going to start with those first 3 because those make the triangle of photography and triangle of light. So if you want to click one more time. So this is our triangle of light, and that's made up of our aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, I won't get too technical here because there's a lot that can go into it, but we'll start with aperture. And with the aperture, that's just a measurement of how open that diaphragm is that allows light to the sensor. So when it's super wide open, when we see that f/1.4, that means that it's because it's measured in a fraction. So that means it's almost fully open. It's allowing the most light in. And how you see that reflected in the photo is that it's going to be a brighter photo, and you're going to have what's called a narrower depth of field. So your subject will be in focus, but the background and foreground might be blurred out. Now, if let's say it's a really bright day, or you're trying to get more of the background to show, then you're going to bump up that aperture to a higher number. So like if we go down to that f32, then that's going to be a very narrow opening to that diaphragm in the camera. And so it's not going to let very much light in. And it's also going to, you're going to have a much sharper image from background to foreground. And then moving on over, we've got the shutter speed. And with the shutter speed, that's just how long that shutter or the diaphragm, how long it's open and allowing light to get to the sensor. So with that, it's pretty much the longer that shutter speed is, so the longer it's open, the more blurred it might be, the more light it's allowing in. Whereas opposite side, the faster it is, it's going to be a much sharper image, and you're not going to have as much light coming through. So if it's a darker day or darker environment, you might need to slow down your shutter speed a little bit. Generally with living subjects, I keep it to about, because it's measured in fractions of a second, I keep it at about 1/125 to 200, somewhere in that range. If it's something like, let's say, a toddler or an animal, it's going to move a little faster, then I might go up to about 500. And then if it's something faster, then you just keep going up from there. But if you've got, let's say, a faster shutter speed, you might need to lower your aperture.
So quick question, Ellie, just for clarification purposes. You mentioned if it's darker, you might need a slower shutter speed to collect more light. But other than that, is there a reason why you don't always just have it on an extremely quick shutter speed so all of your pictures are crisp?
Yeah, so it depends on, like, some folks, depending on the purpose of the photo, you might want to have some of that motion blur to show the speed of the subject, or like it can create a mood if you're, like, let's say you're trying to show that that it's a busy environment, let's say a city street, then you might want to show that motion blur of people going by and doing their business. So that's just one example of it depends on what you're trying to achieve with the photo.
I have a question. So are these manual settings something that you could still use? So it would just be the point and shoots and the DSLR? Like, is it, what about the mirrorless? You said that's a bit different because there's no light being reflected. So does that still have the same manual settings?
It still does. It's just done digitally rather than with
Hmm.
the like all of the gear that goes in with it. So it's just a little bit higher tech with the mirrorless. And
Oh,
then even some like it's different technology, of course, but even some cell phones with their like the advancing technology do offer some like some room for manual settings. So especially like some of the newer like iPhones and like Google has some pretty good ones out there lately. Like they have some room for
Hmm.
manual settings. So it's not necessarily it's not going to get you the same level as the DSLR or the mirrorless, but it's definitely advancing. All right, and then our last of the three for that triangle of light is our ISO. And with the ISO, the other two were about the diaphragm opening and closing for allowing light through. The ISO is specifically about that sensor that the light is coming to. So it's how sensitive that sensor is going to be with the light that is reaching it. So if it's at an ISO level of 100 that we see at that bottom corner, then that's it's not going to be very sensitive at all because that's what we use on a really bright sunny day. And you don't want the sensor to be very sensitive to all of that light that's around. It'll just be too bright then. So you have a lower level of ISO. But if it's let's say an evening or an indoor event or something like that, then you might start bumping your ISO level up. And the main thing that you'll notice is that you might start getting that graininess and that texture to your photo and some freckling of different colors that don't belong. So that's where we start seeing some discoloration and some issues with our photo. So we try to keep our ISO low, but it is one way that we can help if it's a dark area. Now, the last two, those we'll just kind of talk about. We don't have as much of visual, but the white balance, we actually see on that camera screen that's in the background image. So that is signified by that AWB. And there's a few different settings for white balance. Now, with a lot of these, I would say try to go with the manual settings rather than automatic. White balance, I've found, is one that you can usually get away with going with the automatic setting if you're using manual settings. That one, your camera is usually pretty good at sensing what kind of light is in the room. So the white balance just affects, is it going to be a warm, bright photo with more of the orange tones? Or is it the light that's around, is it more of the cooler tones, the blues and all that? And it'll try to balance that. So you can definitely, if you're going to be in one spot continuously, then absolutely go for the shade or iridescent light or one of those specific types of light that it offers as a setting. But if you're going to be moving around from environment to environment, then you probably want to just stick with white balance if you're the automatic setting if you're new to it. And the last one is raw. So that's just the level of memory that each individual image is containing. Raw means that it is taking in everything and recording all of it. With the raw, what we see is we're not losing the details in the extreme bright areas or the extreme dark areas like we would if it recorded in a JPEG or one of the other types of settings. However, with the raw, we do need to do some post-processing or converting of that file before we can use it. So raw files can't be just uploaded or printed. So that's just the one thing with raw, but in general, I would say, if you have that capability to convert it or edit, then absolutely go with raw. Okay. All right. Now we looked at the chart, but just want to use do a couple of visuals to demonstrate how these skills are applied, or these settings are applied. So with these two, we're talking about aperture. Now that was where like how open that diaphragm is for the camera and how much light it's allowing through, which also affects the depth of field. Now, if we click one time, so these two images were taken just a few seconds apart, and the only setting that changed was the aperture. We went from f4.0 to f8.0. And with that, the 4.0, we see it's a brighter image, but we also see that some of the background stuff, such as the fence and that hose, that's kind of could be a distraction in the background, it's starting to get blurred out. However, we also see that he's starting to get, like in the white of his fur, he's starting to get a little bit bleached out. So it's a little bit too far on that, because these are not technically correct photos. They're just demonstrating this one setting. Now, on the flip side, we have f8.0, which isn't a huge jump, but even with that jump, we do see that it's like, as far as the exposure for his fur, it's a little bit more correct. However, we do have the fence and some distracting background that is showing up then. All right. Now, again, these are not technically correct photos. They're just demonstrating the single settings. So we can click one more time. And so this is all about shutter speed. And again, these ones were like one time throwing the ball and then a second time throwing the ball, trying to like get that blurred motion. So with that, we have 1/80th of a second for that shutter speed, which is why I would say, like, definitely if you're working with moving subjects, definitely bump it up to a little bit closer to 1/500 or so. And so, yeah, we've got a blurred doggish shape over there on the left. And then on the right, that's where we're starting to get some pretty crisp, clean lines, even though he's thinking we're gonna jump for that ball or treat or something. Okay, and then we have the ISO. And with ISO, where we really see ISO shine, or like the full potential of it, is like in those darker settings, the like darker environments, whether it's a cloudy day or inside or getting into evening. So this isn't going to show the full like capability of and all the details of ISO, but this was on a cloudy like late afternoon. And so with the 200, that cloudy day is probably not the right environment. It's a little bit too dark at that point for an ISO of 200. We would want to bump that up a little bit or change our other settings, because we've got an f-stop of 11 and 1/500 for shutter speed. So those are pretty high for getting a correct image there. But on a bright sunny day, then 200 would be probably just about right.
So
And
you
then, yes.
sorry, Ellie, you may not know the answer to this, but I'm just curious. So when I'm taking a photo on my iPhone and you can adjust the brightness, is it the ISO that it's kind of picking up and changing, so you can either focus, on a lighter thing or a darker thing, or is that not related?
So it kind of depends. Some of them will, I'm not entirely familiar with the Apple technology as far as like where they take it from, but it would be similar to ISO. It might also be like bumping up the highlights and the shadows of the image. So it could be a combo of both of those. So if it's not using manual settings, then I would say it's probably more likely that it's just bumping the highlights or the shadows. But if it's using manual settings, then I would say it might be adjusting the ISO.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then, yeah, if it was a darker environment, then we would really start to see where that 3200 is probably about the max I would ever go on a picture, even if it was a dark environment. In general, we try to avoid that because we start getting some really bad graininess to images if we go above that. But we just see how much brighter it got just between those two images, though. All right, so those were kind of our manual settings that we want to go into, but there are a couple other principles that we want to talk about. Now, one of the big ones is, especially if we're working with human or animal subjects, then the general rule is that we want to focus on the eyes. Now, with that, there is an exception. If you're trying to specifically draw attention to a different part of the body, then you'd want to focus on that instead, of course. So a big example of that is for my photography business, I've done engagement photos where we want to draw attention to that engagement ring. And so that's a big one that I'll see where we try to like have the hands stretched out and then the faces are going to be in the background. So with that, yeah, we're going to focus on the hands rather than the face and the eyes. But in general, the eyes are where we want to have that attention drawn to. Now, with one of the other general principles that we want to follow is not cutting off any body parts. So if we have any, like if we're doing, let's say, upper body, then we want to avoid chopping off the top of the head. We're trying to be nice to our people and not doing chopping. And then wherever their hands are, we want to avoid having like the wrist cut off in the image and not being shown. So, and if it's a full body, then same thing applies to the feet. It just ends up looking a little disjointed and the audience just kind of feels like something's wrong, even if they can't identify it. Now, I get a little OCD, so this picture just drives me nuts. So, and that's the thing is that some other people are going to like feel exactly the same way, where if your picture is too busy, they don't know where to look. So even if you've got a subject here, like, I would say that the subject would be the hands on the keyboard and going up into the camera, into the computer. But with everything around there, your eye just keeps darting around to, oh, there's a like almost empty tea or coffee, and oh, there's something else. Like, so you don't know where to look. So there's a few ways that we can avoid distractions and keep the audience focused on our subject. So the first one is changing your angle. So if we looked maybe rather than overhead, if we changed to looking from behind the person, we might be able to cut out some of that clutter. We can also just get rid of the distraction and just move everything off of that desk. And then we can zoom in or crop our image. So we can zoom in before while we're still taking the picture, or we can crop afterwards in editing. The last way is we can also change our settings. So we can take that aperture, do a lower aperture, and have the background blurred out and avoiding some of the clutter. All right. Now with photography, it is all about lighting. And with the lighting, we can get lighting from different sources. So natural would include like, light from the sun, could be light from a fire, just something that's not like artificial man-made. And so then on the flip side, we have artificial light, where that's some sort of light bulb, and could be a flash, it could be indoor lighting, like just anything like that. Natural lighting can still be achieved inside, though. It's not that we can't have natural lighting inside. So we like to take advantage of natural lighting through big windows. And then, yeah, artificial lighting can be outside as well. So like if you have a flash on your camera, Or if you, let's say you're working with natural light, but it's not coming from the right direction, you can also use a reflector. So it's just a tool that bounces the light back onto the subject where you want it to be. And then we have hard light versus soft light. So hard light is the high contrast light that's going to create some hard shadows. So let's say it's lighting from the face, then this is a quick demo. Let's see here. Gonna do a flashlight. So, okay, blinding myself, but we see some hard light where we're creating some high contrast where one side of my nose is brightly lit and then the other side is like, it's really dark. So I'm gonna stop blinding myself there. And but with a softer light, that's actually like the light we have right now is softer where it's just kind of a glow around the face and kind of evenly lighting it without creating those hard shadows. Now we have certain times of the day where natural light is going to change. So we have golden hour, and that is the hour after sunset or sunrise and the hour before sunset. That's where we have nice, warm, like golden tones. Super popular for portrait photography. And then we have the blue hour, which, as the name implies, it's kind of the kind of cool tones of the hour before sunrise and the hour after sunset. And with those two, it really just depends on the mood you're trying to like create with your photos. And then the other one to keep in mind is any midday photos. If you're outdoors, you might have some kind of hard light because that sun is just straight over you. With that, there are some natural deflectors and filters that you can use. So if there's fog or if it's a cloudy day, then those can also help soften that light a little bit. All right. Now, we're not doing a full application right now, but I'd really strongly encourage you to just practice with whatever camera you have, because the best camera is the one that you have on you. So with that, like even if it's just a cell phone, or if you have a point and shoot, a DSLR, or if you're running around with a mirrorless camera, be careful. Be careful if you are running with it, but just make sure that you are practicing with it. And I'd encourage you to just like take some photos, just practice with it. And could be a person, could be any subject really. And then think about all the principles and the ideas that have been talked about today. See like what are the positive qualities of the photos, what could be improved, and like using that information from this session, how can we improve those? All right, but I'll make sure, are there any questions that I can answer?
I know one that I had while you were going through your presentation may give folks some time to type in the Q&A chat, or you can also unmute as well to ask any questions. But for the virtual reality app, one of the content types that we can create is a 360 picture or a video. And I know you've had some experience because you've helped us do the filming content for some of the virtual reality apps. With the Insta360 camera, what considerations or tips would you give folks?
Yeah, so with that, one big one is that because you're going to be in the image, try to not distract the audience from like what they're supposed to be looking at. So like try to not have anything that's too distracting on you, first of all, just as the photographer, and try not to be making faces. So that's just like one basically not quite photography, but more of photographer. And then the other one is, especially for folks that are a little bit shorter like me, then make sure that you're getting up high enough where, like, let's say the subject is like just eye level. The great thing about the 360 cameras is that you can see like up above, you can see like, you're seeing all these different angles. But if you're holding it just at eye level and you're vertically challenged like I am, then you're not giving the audience the full potential to see all of those different angles. So those are a couple of ideas there. I would also say those cameras are pretty good at staying stable, so that's not as much of a concern, but try not to move too quickly. It's going to create some motion blur still. And let's see. They're a fun one to work with. It's a little bit different than some of the cameras that they were talking about here, but it's still it's such a fun technology to work with. But I would also say just like, again, just practice with it, kind of get used to it. It's a different feel. And yeah, I think those are kind of the main points.
Yeah, I wish I had your talk before we did our first filming, because when we took the Insta360 camera to 3 Mile Canyon Farm for the dairy farm, we held up the camera so high that we just saw the backs of cows, so like looking down, and we weren't at the eye level of animals. And I think that is a really good point you have, is like, and typically like have it lower. And so then we got the footage, we're like, oh, it's like not as engaging, and it wasn't quite like telling the story that we wanted. So we actually had the opportunity to go back and film again, and we had the Insta360 camera much lower. So it was like even below their eye level, because naturally cows kind of want to investigate. And it was really wild how just the height of the camera changed the story that we told, because it was a lot more engaging to see like their faces and just the top of them. So like an aerial view. So
absolutely.
That was really cool. So I needed you. Where were you?
It's cows. I would have, if I could have made it, I would have been there.
I know. You're busy. You're a busy person. Okay, cool. Yeah, I just thought that would be because that's, you know, one opportunity that folks can have with either the Panda Guide, which is a 360 picture, and then there's 2D pictures within the Panda Guide, and then there's also the 360 video. But that's kind of like a different camera.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions?
So how do these foundations change if we're using a camera as a video camera? So anything else to consider there?
It's really a lot of the same principles. You're going to just be changing. Some cameras are going to be a little bit more fixed on shutter speed or ISO. Like they might have those manual settings fixed in a video setting. So with that, you might need to adjust your other settings to balance for those fixed settings. But besides that, it's a lot of the same principles. It's like, especially the focusing on the eyes and not chopping anything off. Like all of those still apply. It's just kind of how those manual settings are going to be applied.
I don't see any questions coming in. So I think we are going to call it, unless Ellie, you have any last minute thoughts you wanted to add?
Really, the only other thing is just if there's ever any questions, I'm still happy to answer stuff later on. So please ask. There's no bad questions. We're all trying to learn it. So
absolutely. I love that. So if you do have questions, whether you are watching live and think of something later, or you're watching this as a recording, please send those questions to us, dye4ag@oregonstate.edu, and we will connect with Ellie and make sure that those get answered for you. As far as webinars are concerned, this one is over. So we will see you again. Please let us know if you have questions, and we are very excited to see what you come up with. So thank you, Ellie, for joining us again.
Of course.
Bye, everyone.